Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
And hello again. Welcome back to Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. Today's guest is well known to CTV viewers across Canada and perhaps around the world. I don't know. We're talking with Jeff Hutcheson, all the way from Prince Edward Island. But before we get into that, just a reminder, if you enjoy our podcast, please click on our Patreon link. Just go to Patreon and Talking Books and give us a hand. It would be much appreciated. So, hello to Jeff Hutcheson. We'll be on the air in a little while. But first of all, the last few months in your area as well as everywhere else, how are things shaping up?
Well, in Prince Edward, and first of all, thanks for having me, Dennis. I really appreciate it, and hello to everyone listening. It's great to be heard again, I guess. Here in Prince Edward Island, of course, we have very few cases. We're dealing with very few cases of COVID. In fact, over the last several days here, we've had a cluster of 11, and that brought our total since March to 88. So we certainly haven't been seeing the angst and anxiety, I think, of some other provinces, although even because of our size, we're seeing people have that same angst and anxiety that I'm talking about. But we're certainly benefiting being an island and being able to, restrict access across the bridge and through the ferry. And Air Canada has all but pulled out of Charlottetown now. So we actually are in a pretty good place, but certainly feel for everyone out there who is just trying to stay safe during these times.
So, personally, on your side, what have you been doing in the last few 6, 8, 10, 12 months during this whole lockdown, no lockdown, back to lockdown, no lockdown, can't leave your house, you can leave your house thing?
Well, it's interesting. I was actually, like many Canadians, I go to Florida in the winter now. And in fact, I mean, that's sort of what my retirement has been. I have grandkids in Ontario, and I, visit them and visit friends and then make trips to Florida. And my wife and I will go away for a little bit. So I happen to be in, and by the way, that's a routine now I'm gravely missing, but I happen to be in Florida when, Canada closed the borders, and the insurance I had gave me 10 days to get home. So I came home on March the 19th, made that rush home, and had to self-isolate for 2 weeks. And of course, Dennis, back then, we really knew nothing about this thing. And, I can remember being in sheer fear in the baggage line, trying to keep my distance. So luckily, we got home with no problem. And we have, had a great summer. I'm a golfer. So I had the summer of my life golfing. As you may or may not know, rounds of golf are up astronomically across North America. And so I spent a lot of time golfing. My wife and I actually did 5 staycations here on PEI. We rented cottages for a couple of nights and discovered different things about the island. Having said that, she's still working as a teacher. So since September, I was able to golf into September and October. But we just instituted kind of a mini lockdown here as a result of the cluster. But quite honestly, October, November, December have been pretty slow. You're kind of looking for things to do. So I'm actually writing a weekly column for one of the local newspapers here, the Eastern Graphic. So kind of putzing around with that and getting ideas and writing it and everything, as you know, is a lot of fun. But all in all, these last couple of months, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, have been pretty slow for me.
Well, we're the same. We usually go out we have a place in Washington State on the coast out there, because I used to live in Bellingham, Washington. So we go out there, but we haven't gone for over a year. So I know exactly what you mean. You like to get away, even if, you like your hometown, but sometimes you want to go somewhere else. And now, of course, we can't really go very far.
Well, and I'm one of these Canadians, and I'm saddened by it. I have 6 grandkids in Ontario. And I mean, I couldn't go visit them now if I wanted to because where this Atlantic bubble is closed. But I have not seen them. So I have my 3 kids, each have a family, and 2 grandkids each. So I have not seen them since January 31st of last year. And the way things are going here, I suspect that it will be likely. I mean, and I'm hoping for summer to get back to Ontario to see them. And Dennis, I mean, you can Zoom and FaceTime all you want, but quite frankly, if I don't see my one granddaughter till July, she'll have been 6 months old when I last saw her, and 2 years old when I next see her. And so, I'm changing, the kids are changing, but I get it, and I get it, I understand it. I'm not, I'm not one of these, I'm not complaining about it, although, you think about it and talk about it, but I understand the situation, and I understand there's a lot of people in the same situation and have even worse family scenarios.
Oh, yeah, and there's still people who think it's just the common cold, so...
Well, and I have little time for them.
Exactly. I mean, we don't wear a mask in the house, but pretty well everywhere else we do, so... what's the population, by the way, of Prince Edward Island where Jeff Hutcheson lives, who we're speaking with right now?
Well, the entire population here is 156,000, and Charlottetown would be, and Charlottetown, would be... there's Charlottetown, and right across the river, it's kind of like the Battlefords. Right across the river, there's a town called Stratford. So I suspect that the Charlottetown-Stratford kind of hub of Prince Edward Island is maybe 53,000 people. So that's what we're dealing with here. Pretty small all in all. And like I said, benefiting us at this point.
And with that small of a tax base to run a province, how do you provide all the services that are needed? I mean, that's half the population of the city of Saskatoon.
You're going to get me started here. And what I lived in Toronto and moved here. I met my wife. I got remarried and met my wife, and I commuted from Toronto to Prince Edward Island every week for 12 years when I was on Canada AM. Every week for 12 years I commuted. My wife and I figure in that period of time we're apart 2,500 nights in doing that. And one of the things that always gets me about Prince Edward Island, and I believe the number is 30, but it might be 28, but this island with 156,000 total people has 28 members of provincial parliament. The riding I used to live in Toronto, which was the Spadina riding, had 90,000 people living in it for one person. So yes, we're highly governed out here. I think over-governed. I don't know how else you do it. And, Prince Edward Island, because of the Constitution and our population, we have 4 senators here. 4 senators for 156,000 people. So, the Constitution guaranteed a little bit, and there's some inequities. But, you're right. I mean, the roads here aren't the greatest. We're struggling with health care. We're struggling with, mental health. We're struggling with, education in terms of being able to provide all the services for the very reasons you say. The tax base is so small.
Exactly, and Jeff Hutcheson is with us. A lot of people know him, of course, from CTV, Canada AM, Good Morning Canada, how many other different iterations or iterations it had, I don't know, and I don't even know if that's the right word, and I don't even know how to say it. But let's go back, way back. Where'd you get your start? Are you born in Toronto, I take it?
No, I actually, it's one of those things where I was born in Hamilton, Ontario, but I'm not really from Hamilton because my mom and dad lived in a little town called Font Hill in near Niagara Falls, and grew up there for about 8 years, and then we moved to a town called, it was Preston, and then in Canada, Galt, Preston, and Hespeler became the first amalgamated community in the country to become what's known as Cambridge. So grew up there, sort of went to Conestoga College, got a job, luckily, at the local TV station, and, kind of worked my way through and spent the next 40 years in television, 20 years at what was then CKCO TV Kitchener. It's now CTV Kitchener, much like you had CKCK Regina, and now you have, CTV Regina. CTV Saskatoon.
Right.
And I worked 20 years at Canada AM, there was a period there for about 5 years where I was filling in part-time. So my total tenure at Canada AM, I believe, is about 23 or 24 years.
And why'd you select broadcasting, or did it select you?
You know what? I'll tell you what. I selected broadcasting because when I was a kid growing up, I used to fall asleep with my bed had a little cubby hole, and I had a little transistor radio in that cubby hole. And I used to be able to listen to all these disc jockeys just from where we were, from New York City, WABC, and from Chicago, WLS. And I thought there'd be nothing better than being a radio disc jockey. I mean, I was romanticizing hearing these guys and how powerful it all sounded to me. So I actually began to get into broadcasting to become a radio announcer. And believe me, I lucked into the television side initially by getting a pretty good part-time job at a TV station early on when I was at school. But I used to walk to piano lessons years and years ago, doing a fake radio show in my head, announcing a song, singing it. And I had a long walk there, Dennis, but that's where it was to me. I was just in love with radio.
I got into radio because I didn't want to work for a living and I didn't know what else to select. So I ended up going to BCIT out in Burnaby after high school and then bounced around for 30 years and then retired and drove a school bus and pumped gas, but which paid more than being in radio, let me tell you.
Yeah.
But what would you say to someone today who wants to get into broadcasting? Would you say, forget about it, or, hey, good luck?
I don't think I would ever say to anyone, hey, forget about it. But I would take a good hard look at it. And all you have to do is look at the streamlining and, amalgamating that the large corporate people are doing now. You really have to be, one person now can be heard across the country, doing a radio show. And I believe within the last year, there was a company called Stingray who owns a couple of the radio stations out here.
Right.
And I believe it was in Alberta, but it might have been with you guys, but they bought a bunch of local radio stations, 15 of them, laid off all the morning shows, and had one guy now doing all those local morning shows. And I believe that's in Alberta. And that's the trend of the business. I mean, we have a guy here in PEI who does shows for, Nova Scotia. Now, having said that, if you talk about television production, you'll always need people. If you talk about people in front of the camera, you'll always need people. If you talk about reporters, until this next great thing comes along, and it hasn't yet, you'll always need people. So I don't discourage people from getting into it, but I think it's a lot different to get into it now than when you and I were dipping our toes in, and me in the mid 70s.
Yep.
And so I would never say don't, but I would make sure you have a career path an idea for a career path as to where you want to go, it's an interesting business now to be on the outside looking in. I'll tell you that. And quite frankly, I'm glad to be on the outside looking in right now.
I am too, but yeah, I know what you're saying. I got out of DCIT 2-year course, learned everything about broadcasting, radio, television. I could probably do and have pretty much every job in either sort of setting, well, at least not do it, but know about it. And the thing then was that, in British Columbia, you say go to the interior. So you go to Williams Lake or Prince George or something where they had all-night shows on radio, or they needed extra news people because they had 5 or 6 in the department, or 3 or 4 copywriters or traffic people, etc., etc. And now, no, there's no all-night shows that I know of in any station anywhere that I can think of. No real place to get a start unless it's, the weekend guy who hauls the remote equipment around. Weekend person. So,
well, I agree that it's getting harder to cut your teeth at smaller stations, which used to be the way people went. You'd work at a smaller station and then get to a bigger station and then a bigger station. And, that was kind of your ladder to success. But I do agree that, those opportunities are few and far between now, especially with automation. I mean, you're right. I mean, even some afternoon slots across the country in radio, don't have or are totally automated for several shows. And another thing, when I worked in local television in Kitchener, when I first started there in 1976, I'm going to guess local production-wise, that station in Little Kitchener, Ontario, which, would have been about the size of Saskatoon. I think Kitchener, Waterloo now are maybe 400,000 or 500,000, but it was pumping out maybe, 2 local morning shows a day. It was pumping out maybe 6 or 7 weekly programs, and all that's gone. Everything now, the only thing, if you look at CTV, the only time you're not watching what the rest of the country's watching is when your local news is on. And that's it.
Yep. And, Diane, the same way, she was at CTV Saskatoon in its various guises for nearly 45 years. And the television jobs she did before going into the sales department don't exist anymore. Production assistant, promotion writer, stuff like that. And when she started in the newsroom, as sort of the file clerk and rewrite person, there was 13 people. So, and that was just the television. Well, it was for television and radio, and then it all split apart. So I know what you're saying, but back to your early days, just to jump around here a bit. Jeff Hutcheson is our guest today. Listening to those big stations from back east Chicago, like you listened to B. Mitchell Reed and Cousin Brucey and Larry Lou Jack and Dick Biondi and those kind of guys?
All right, you just named 4 of them right there. And Bob Dearborn out of Chicago, but Cousin Brucey Morrow and, all these guys were, and we used to, pick up KMOX in St. Louis every now and then to get a little bit different. But that's, and those, really, I mean, those years that I was listening, and that would have been the late 60s, early 70s, I mean, those were the halcyon days of rock and roll radio. That's the day where you could hear Dominique, the Singing Nun, or the Singing Nun and the Beatles on the same AM station.
At the back to back.
Right.
Yeah.
And now, of course, and this is why everything, and then, of course, but this is a natural progression to this so-called, and there's a channel for everything now, and why it's tough sometimes for even local music to, and Canadian music to break in, because their niche is maybe not providing a radio outlet for them. So, but that's a whole other conversation, I realize. But no, it's those halcyon days of radio, which I love. I just absolutely love.
Well, I was lucky enough to be at CFUN in Vancouver in mid to late 70s, so that was pretty much the high point, and then all that top 40 radio kind of stuff died out in the 80s, but I know of what you speak. Jeff Hutcheson is with us. We're on Talking Books and Writing and stuff, so let's talk about books. Apparently you have a couple of travel books you've produced. Tell us about those.
Well, yeah, I have a book, I have a couple. One I wrote, and I was, a little backstory here is that in 2002, I received an email from a gentleman I didn't even know in Ottawa by the name of John McQuarrie. And he said, he's been watching Canada AM, and I traveled across the country a lot with that show. Probably in my career, I've been to 300 to 400 towns in Canada. I mean, I traveled a lot. And he said, he says, I've got this kind of a coffee table book on Canada. I want to know if you want to write for it. And I immediately emailed him back, and I said, geez, no, sorry, John, but thanks for asking. Within the next month, I was doing one of these remote shows that I would do quite a bit, and I had gone to Ottawa, and it was for Winterlude. And I checked into the Chateau Laurier there, and the lady at the front desk said, oh, there's a package for you. So this John McQuarrie had guessed I was going to be staying there. So remember back then, you couldn't send things digitally. So he had photocopied his idea for the book and sent it to me. So I go up in my room and I'm looking at it and I'm going, okay, well, I've been there. So I've been to about 75% of the places. So I decided I'd do it. And luckily I got called to jury duty in Toronto. And being as I would never have a chance of being on a jury because it's just the profession I was in, journalists don't get accepted for the most part.
Right.
I wrote the thing while I was on jury duty for a couple of weeks waiting to be called for a jury. So anyway, I mean, long story short, the thing had some pretty good legs. I just actually, in anticipation of being here chatting with you, I just connected with John, and that book sold about 50,000 copies. So, and it's still going a little bit. And then there was an offshoot called The Best of Atlantic Canada, which I think sold about 5,000 or 6,000 copies. But the book, The Best of Canada, I would go and do a remote. I remember doing a Grey Cup remote in Regina and then going out to the chapters there and doing a book signing. So it was fun to be involved in that. It was fun to kind of see how that whole world operates. And, and I often used to joke when I finished the book in 2002, I used to tell my kids that I'd now, written one more book than I've read. But
yes. Oh, good. And the first one, your coloring book, the crayons broke halfway through. No, just kidding.
So it was an interesting experience to do. And it's, every now and then you can go into a store and still see it 18 years later. So, I mean, he's updated it a little bit, but it was a fun experience. But I don't have any. When I left Canada AM, it was suggested that, you should write a book. And, I didn't even really give it much thought. Now, you may or may not know that my former co-host, Marcy Ian, has just published a book.
And she got elected to Parliament, too.
Well, I got to tell you, so the last team of 4 for Canada AM, and this would have kicked in at 2003. So from 2003 to 2011, the team at Canada AM, the daily team, was Seamus O'Regan, Marcy Ian, Bev Thompson, and myself. So Seamus O'Regan is now in Parliament from Newfoundland and is the Federal Minister of Natural Resources. Marcy Ian is now the Federal Parliamentary Member for Toronto Centre. Bev Thompson was awarded the Order of Canada last summer for her charitable work, and I'm Ringo.
You're Ringo. You're like the Pete Best of the group.
That's right. But no. That's a pretty accomplished group that I spent a lot of time with there. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
No, it was a great show. What was your daily routine like when you were working on that show?
Well, when I did Canada AM, and I did that for upwards of almost 20 years, I would my daily kind of wake up time was 3:45, and I would kind of be up and out of the house or where I was living probably by 5 after 4, arriving at the station no later than 4:30. Like, Dennis, even 4:32 would throw my whole day off. So I would arrive at 4:30. And then at that point, I had to, I had to prep the weather. I had to prep the sports. And kind of as Canada AM went on, I began doing a thing called Things I've Learned on the Internet Today, which absolutely exploded as a feature on the show. And I had to look, through 15 or 25 different websites at the time to try and find the video for that. I also had to do, kind of openings leading into the weather, little fun videos there. So it was a pretty intense 4.5 to 5 hours, by the time you arrived to the time you got off the air. And then I would usually get out of there at, 11 o'clock, 10:30, 11 o'clock. But I traveled so much, it'd be nothing for me if I were coming to do a remote in Regina, for example, and we did several at the Science Center there, I can remember. I would get up at 3:45, go to work, go to the airport, fly to Regina, get up and because of the time change, I would get up at 2 o'clock. The show there would start at 4 and get on a plane and fly home, all probably within 36 hours, and then be at work the next day. So, yeah, well, it was, and it was just a strange, I remember when I retired, and this, of course, and then I flew back and forth every week to Prince Edward Island in the last 12 years of my time there. And I remember the Saturday after I retired, that was the day after they, unceremoniously dumped the show. I was sitting on the back deck, and my wife said, "Wow, I can't believe you just did that for 12 years." But at the end of the day, it's just what it was. You didn't think about it; you just did it. And it's actually, to me, sounds like whenever I tell people this story, or talking about the 2,500 nights away from from my wife, or the 37,000 weather casts I did, the numbers sound impressive now, but when you're doing them, it's like just another day.
Just another day, just another blur.
Yeah.
Do we have anything good to say about broadcast management, or should we leave that topic alone?
Well, I mean, quite frankly, I when Canada AM stopped, I wrote a blog. I started a blog called "I Used to Be on TV," and I spent that summer writing about the demise of Canada AM. And I was up about 380,000 views on this thing, writing about that. So I knew people were kind of interested in hearing the story. But at the end of the day, as much as I disliked what happened and really disliked how it happened and how a lot of people were treated, I can't complain because I was retiring in 2 weeks, but, my co-hosts, so they were treated, and a lot of the staff of our show. But I do understand, and it was always my bottom line is, it's business, and they're going to do what they feel they have to do. So I understand it's business, but admittedly, I have some bitter feelings about how it ended for everyone, not myself, but I mean, including myself. And it could have been handled a lot better, but it is what it is. And like I said, Dennis, that's the business.
Yeah, well, it's show business. There's the show, and then there's the business. So you got to have can't have one without the other, and vice versa. So I was only fired twice in my broadcast career. The other times I quit before I got fired, but once by telephone after I got back from vacation. That was the worst one. And the other one...
Yeah, that's classy.
The other one was a guy, and I'll say this without trying to sound sexy. It was man-to-man. He face-to-face and said, "We're sorry, we're moving in another direction, blah, blah, blah." That was okay. But on the phone, after coming back from vacation, I mean, give me a break, you blankety blank. But anyway.
Yeah.
Oh,
well, I sat through, I made it through a lot of really terrible days at Toronto, including... I was working at the CTV headquarters as well, the aging court. They had downtown at that time as well. Yep. But I mean, I was there the day that like 170 people were laid off in one day. Oh. And this was a situation where you had guys who had been there. Well, I mean, I'm sure my friend, I have a good friend, is Dan Matheson. He'd been with CTV since probably 1973.
Oh yeah,
and was working at News Channel. And I mean, Dan had done Olympics. Dan was the face of their hockey telecast. Dan was the face of Canada AM.
Right.
Dan went over and helped get News Channel off the air. And when they let Dan go, they called him into, in Dan's case, it was a special office. They'd set an area up upstairs with about 7 offices for people to just file into. But they handed Dan his envelope. And the thing that always has bothered me is, they had a security guy escort him out the door. So that, to me, has always felt heavy-handed. And we had a lot of people like that. Producers I worked with were terminated in the same way without a single shred of dignity. It's like they always have a fear that someone is going to go off or someone's going to destroy or trash the place. Right. These are broadcast professionals they were laying off, who hope to work again.
Exactly.
But that way of laying off people and letting them go, that's another thing that I have a lot of disdain for. And my friend Dan, the way he was treated after 40 years and really being one of the guys who brought that network, especially the sports department, into its own, it was pretty bad. There's no doubt about it. It was just really, really poorly done.
Well, the same thing pretty much happened to Diane Anderson. Remember my wife when they told her they gave her 2 weeks' notice to accept this golden handshake thing, and she was not supposed to talk to anybody about it, including her boss, who didn't know. And then it was pack up your stuff and go, and you can't even come back to get your lunch out of the refrigerator. So
yeah,
figured out.
Well, I'll tell you a little story about the end of Canada AM. So on June the 3rd, it ended, and they let the country know and our staff know on June the 2nd. One day. So, all of a sudden there's this announcement that Canada AM is over tomorrow. Now, Bev and Marcy and myself were the three hosts at that time. When Seamus left in 2011, they didn't replace him. And we each got called into a meeting 2 weeks prior to that. We're told the show was being canceled, and we had to sign an NDA that we wouldn't say a thing to anybody before they told the staff 2 weeks later. So I remember I was doing kind of a going away tour as my career was winding down. And I mean, I was doing a show here in Prince Edward Island. I did a show in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. The premier of Nova Scotia, Stephen McNeil at the time, was at. Wade McLaughlin, who was the premier here, was at that show. And they're all asking me, and I had to lie to two premiers and thousands of people.
Right.
And I'm doing these shows with all our staff who would, the producers would come in, talking about the future and everything. And I remember sitting in the back seat of the car, driving from Lunenburg back to Halifax, and the producer in the front seat with the cameraman. And they were talking about things they were getting ready and shoots they had this summer and everything else. And it was all I could do not to burst out in tears. And I couldn't say a thing.
Yep.
So, and at least they let us have a day to say goodbye. Like, at least they gave us 1 day. It's not like, they said, okay, that's it. Yeah. They gave us 1 day to say goodbye. And we had to cram, close to 44 years of Canada AM history into that 1 day. And everybody really stepped up. But, it was done. It was handled very, very, very poorly. There's no doubt about that.
Well, it's kind of like pro sports, It's like, okay, you were the MVP last year, but we're trading you to Buffalo for 3 bags of pucks and a broken stick. Thank you very much. Goodbye. So,
well, there's an adage because, quite frankly, the way the Canada AM was such a brand, and they just completely they gave little thought. My opinion is to the brand that Canada AM was. Although they got rid of all of us, they could have easily kept Marcy and Bev, or at least one of them, and kept calling it Canada AM. But people were so upset the show was the show was canceled that it bruised the announcement the following week of Your Morning. And it took them a long time to recover because there was such a negative backlash against CTV for what happened at Canada AM. But Dennis, I could remember my friend who we just talked about, Dan Matheson, at my 50th birthday party. And I think this is the I've never forgotten this. When he got up and he was speaking about my career, and he said, there are 3 phases to someone's career. Phase number 1, he's the next best thing. Phase number 2, get me Jeff Hutcheson. Phase number 3, get me the next Jeff Hutcheson. So right. I've never forgotten that, and that's so true. I mean, and luckily I lasted another 12 years after that curse by Dan, but it's certainly true. I see what they were trying to do with the show, and it's still in the air almost 5 years later as to whether or not it's working, but the market's so fractured now, and as you know, there's so many available places to get information. TV's a tough go for information right now across the board because it's so accessible 24/7 everywhere.
We're talking with Jeff Hutcheson. On a positive note, we're not trying to bash CTV on the air or any people on the air. It's just the facts of life, and one of these, you have to take the good with the bad or the bad with the good, so that's what we're discussing here. But on a positive note, before we wrap it up, Jeff Hutcheson, your newspaper column, tell us about that. How did that start, and what do you cover, and can we read it online? How's that going? Yes,
actually, okay, yeah. I mean, so when I was coming back from I mentioned I'd written this blog, and this was back in the summer of 2016. And it was. I mean, I guess if you go by how many views and everything you had, it was pretty successful. But it sort of ended up petering out by Christmas of 2016 and everything else. So switch ahead to last March of 2019, and I'm home, and I have to isolate. So I'm living upstairs in our house. My wife is living downstairs. We are full rule followers here. We kept our 6-foot distance. We didn't eat together. We watched and everything else. And, we'd be in the same room about 10 feet away watching TV. So I took to Facebook on a daily measure on daily, and I began just writing little stories about how my day went. And believe me, they were, I would write 300 words about baking chocolate chip cookies or, something like that. So the publisher of what's known as the Eastern Graphic, and it's also known as Island Press. So I'll just give a little plug here that Island Press, and I believe it's .com, but it might be .ca, but islandpress.com is the online home for this column. And so the publisher of this paper, who I'd known, through the business, got a hold of me and said, "Hey, do you want to write a weekly?" He says, "I've been reading your stuff on Facebook. Are you interested in writing kind of a slice of life column, that will put a smile on people's faces?" Yeah, I thought about it for a little bit, and I thought, you know what? Well, the worst I could do is give it a try. And so I started that. I think my first column was April 1st or 2nd, and I'm still going. And Dennis, the beauty of this is he's paying me in golf, so it's perfect.
That's a perfect anecdote, a perfect way to end it. Jeff Hutcheson has been with us today on Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. And quickly before we go, if you enjoy this podcast and all our others, over 70, almost 80 now, click on our Patreon. That's Patreon. Patreon link for Talking Books, and maybe help us out a little bit. Jeff Hutcheson, thank you very much, and good golfing one day soon.
Well, Dennis, thank you, and thanks for having me. And I appreciate the time to kind of get back out there a little bit. It's nice. Thanks so much, Dennis. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.